game theory this, game theory that, or you may never even heard of the term game theory, but you've been playing that every single day. So what is game theory? Let's figure it out together. Every day when you're going to work, you have a choice whether to take a public transport, drive to your job, or walk there. Or if you're driving, you have a choice whether to take one road versus another road. Your choice will be depending on what the traffic is. And traffic is caused by other people. So you're taking into the consideration other people's action before you're going to do something yourself. In simple terms, game theory is all about making decisions while also keeping in mind what others are going to do. The official definition of game theory is the study of mathematical models of strategic interactions among the rational players. It is very important to know that in game theory, the players have to be rational. Otherwise, all your models get destroyed and game theory is not applicable. Game theory focuses on maximizing the win and consists of players, strategy, and outcomes. Another thing important to note that there have to be several players, multiple, because something like a game of Sudoku is not really game theory because there is only one player. Something like Monopoly would be a game theory. Chess, perfect example. So players. Players are your decision makers. Strategies are what players do. And outcomes are just outcomes or consequences. Let's look at the classic example, prisoner's dilemma. So the police caught 2 prisoners, but they do not have enough evidence to put those prisoners in jail for the maximum time. So they give the prisoners 2 options, whether to confess or not confess. If they both confess, each of them is going to spend 20 years in jail. If they both do not confess, each of them is going to spend only 10 years in jail. If one confesses and the other one doesn't, one is going to spend 30 years in jail and the other one is going to spend 5 years in jail, and vice versa. So this matrix shows you the outcome of those decisions. So how to read this matrix? Everything that is in blue will be the consequences and the strategies for prisoner number 1, and everything in orange is going to be the outcomes and strategies for prisoner number 2. If prisoner number 2 chooses to confess, what should the prisoner number 1 do? So you're going to cover everything that is not confessed, because right now we're looking at what prisoner number 1 going to do if prisoner number 2 is going to confess. So covering everything that is here and only look at the blue numbers. So if prisoner number 2 chooses to confess, prisoner number 1 has a choice, either to confess or not confess. If prisoner number 1 confesses, then he's going to spend 20 years in jail. If he chooses not to confess, he's going to spend 30 years in jail. If he is a rational player, he is going to choose to confess, because this way he's going to spend less time in prison. Let's do the same if prisoner number 2 chooses not to confess, what the prisoner number 1 should do. I'm going to cover the confess, whatever. If prisoner number 2 chooses not to confess, prisoner number 1 has a choice. If he doesn't confess, he's going to spend 10 years in jail. If he confesses, he's going to spend only 5 years in jail. So what the prisoner number 1 should do? Of course, he is going to confess, because this way he's going to spend less time in jail. So I'm going to underline this again. So the prisoner number 1 dominant strategy, what he's going to do no matter what, is going to be to confess. So I'm just going to put a tick mark. For prisoner number 2, let's do the same thing. Prisoner number 1 chooses to confess. So I'm going to cover everything that is here and look only at the orange numbers. Prisoner number 1 chooses to confess. Prisoner number 2, prisoner number 2 confesses, he's going to spend 20 years in jail. If he doesn't confess, he's going to spend 30 years in jail. Of course, if prisoner number 2 is a rational player, he's going to confess because he wants to spend less time in jail. Underline that. So if prisoner number 1 chooses not to confess, what the prisoner number 2 should do? I'm going to cover the top row. and look only at the orange numbers. If prisoner number 2 chooses to confess, he's going to spend 5 years in jail. If he chooses not to confess, he's going to spend 10 years in jail. Of course, as a rational player, he wants to spend only 5 years in jail. So I'm going to highlight that. Okay, so we see that for prisoner number 2, the dominant strategy is also to confess. Now let me define what the dominant strategy is. In very simple terms, the dominant strategy is no matter what the other player does, you're still going to act the same. So you see, no matter what the prisoner number 2 does, prisoner number 1 is always going to confess. So for prisoner number 1, the dominant strategy is to confess. The same is for prisoner number 2, that no matter what the prisoner number 1 does, prisoner number 2 is also going to confess. If both prisoners choose to confess, they reach Nash equilibrium and both are going to spend 20 years in jail. So let me define what Nash equilibrium is. Nash equilibrium is the outcome of a non-cooperative game. So since two prisoners are not allowed to cooperate and they're sitting in two different rooms, they cannot communicate with each other, they both are going to confess. So they assume that the other prisoner is acting rational, so they should also act rationally, and therefore both of them are spending the maximum time in prison. And I also want to highlight that this game is played simultaneously, is that both players are acting at the same time. Unlike game of chess, where one player goes, makes a decision, makes a step, then the other person based on that makes his own decision. One, another. And here they're doing this, they're making decisions simultaneously. So now let's do an example related to Bitcoin. It will be a very, very simple example so everyone can understand it. So lately we have seen that a lot of politicians are joining Bitcoin. They're so pro-Bitcoin. Let's do a matrix on that. So say there are two politicians that are running for the office. And they're trying to get as many voters as they can. And they have a position either to be pro-Bitcoin or be against or neutral towards Bitcoin. And we have seen that many Bitcoiners are actually supporting politicians who are supporting Bitcoin. So a politician has two choices, either to be pro-Bitcoin or be against or stay neutral. If both politicians are supporting Bitcoin, then both of them are getting 100 more votes. If both of them are staying neutral, then they're not getting more voters. If one of them stays neutral while the other one is being vocal, then the one who is pro-Bitcoin is getting Bitcoiners' attention and is getting more votes. And the one who stays neutral or against it is not getting any attention at all. So let's see what is going to be the dominant strategy for these politicians. If politician number 2 is going to be pro-Bitcoin, what politician number 1 should do? So we're going to cover this, and if politician number 2 is going to be pro-Bitcoin, politician number 1 has to choose whether he wants to be pro-Bitcoin and get 100 votes, or attention of 100 people, or get donation of 100 people, whatever, or he chooses to stay neutral and get 0 attention. Of course, he wants to be pro-Bitcoin. Let's do the same thing if politician number 2 chooses not to be pro-Bitcoin. So politician number 1 has a choice. If he wants to be pro-Bitcoin, he's going to get 200 votes, 200 attention, whatever, blah, 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 or stay neutral and get 0 attention. Of course, he wants to be pro-Bitcoin. Politician number 1, dominant strategy is to be pro-Bitcoin. Let's look at the same situation for politician number 2. Politician number 1 chooses to be pro-Bitcoin. What should politician number 2 do? He has a choice either to be pro-Bitcoin or neutral against it. If he is going to be pro-Bitcoin, he's going to have 100 people supporting him. Just gonna underline them. Same thing goes if politician number 1 stays against Bitcoin. So just gonna cover this. And if politician number 2 is going to be pro-Bitcoin while politician number 1 stays neutral, he's going to get 200 votes, 200 people on his side. And if he chooses to stay neutral, he's going to get 0 votes. So of course he wants to go with 200. So he's going to be pro-Bitcoin. So we see that the dominant strategy for both politicians is to be pro-Bitcoin, whether or not they're actually pro-Bitcoin. At least that will get them to serve in the office and get more power. Game theory is a great manipulation tool, and I suggest that all of you start researching game theory and getting to know that so you can win every single day. See you in the next video. Bye bye.